Okay, so we're diving into the Wounded Knee occupation, 1973. It's a story that, well, it grabs you, but there's a lot to unpack. We're really talking about, I guess, a moment in history where, well, past injustices clash with political unrest and, the fight for Native American rights.
And to really get the full weight of the 73 occupation, we have to go back, back to 1890 to the massacre at Wounded Knee. It's not just history, right? It's a living memory for the Lakota people, a wound that, well, never really healed and really fueled what happened in 73.
Yeah, the Pine Ridge Reservation, early 70s, it was a powder keg, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Our sources describe, well, Dick Wilson, he was the Oglala Lakota tribe chairman, and there were these accusations, of corruption, and he was using, well, strong-arm tactics pretty much against anyone who questioned him.
Yeah, and it
Back
was
then.
in that atmosphere, all that tension, that the American Indian movement, AIM, arrived,
Right. AM.
led by figures like Dennis Banks and Russell Means and AM. They weren't afraid to use dramatic tactics, even confrontational ones, to get attention for the issues facing Native Americans.
And their arrival at Wounded Knee, February 73, late at night, it was anything but subtle. I mean, picture this, 54 cars rolling in, filled with AIM members, families, elders, and armed men from all different tribes. What a statement, right? What do you think? What were they trying to say with such a dramatic entrance?
Oh, they were sending a powerful message, that's for sure. And that message was amplified by Leonard Crow Dog. He was a spiritual leader. His speech, he invoked the spirits of those massacred in 1890,
Hmm.
directly connecting that past suffering to what they were going through right then. He framed the whole occupation as a continuation of their resistance against centuries of oppression.
And they weren't there just to make a statement. They took hostages, they set a bridge on fire, basically cut off access to the village. It wasn't a peaceful sit-in. This was a bold declaration.
Right? It was a real escalation. And on the other side of all this drama, we have Joseph Trimbach. He was a newly appointed FBI special agent in charge, and he was, well, clearly over his head.
Yeah, brand new to the job, and suddenly he's in the middle of this volatile situation.
It's hard to imagine.
Our sources say he even found out about the takeover from a reporter, not his own agents. What does that tell you?
Oh, it speaks volumes, doesn't it, about how chaotic it all was. And in his conversations with John Taranis, who was the Justice Department representative, well, they really show that tension, between law enforcement and those who are, well, advocating for social change. Trimbach, he seemed wary, I guess you could say, of Taranis's sympathy for Ames' grievances.
And then you have Dick Wilson. He's the tribal chairman under fire. He saw AIM as a threat,
Huh.
an unwelcome intrusion, and he wasn't backing down. He even formed his own vigilante group, the Goons, and they were funded in part by federal money, which just adds another layer to all of this.
It does. And it's important to understand the goons, they were just some random group. They were connected to Wilson's administration. And what they did, well, it reflected those deep divisions within the Oglala Lakota tribe itself.
Yeah.
And them getting funding from the government, well, it raises questions about the government's role,
Mhm.
in fueling these conflicts.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. To really understand AIM's motivations, we
Yeah.
need to look at, well, the personal stories of people like Dennis Banks, his life, his experiences. They really show the injustices, the systemic injustices faced by Native Americans. It's a stark reminder of the struggles that led to AIM's formation.
Right. Banks' story is really intertwined with that broader fight for Native rights. His childhood, being forced into a BIA boarding school, his time in the military, which really disillusioned him, even his incarceration, where he saw, firsthand how many Native Americans were in prison. All these experiences, they fueled his activism.
But it wasn't just personal, right? AIM wasn't just reacting to local issues on Pine Ridge. They had a national agenda.
Exactly. And a prime example of that was the 1972 Trail of Broken Treaties caravan to Washington, D.C., led by Russell Means. They didn't want, just minor changes. They demanded sweeping reforms.
Okay, so the Trail of Broken Treaties, what were their demands? What were they actually asking for?
Well, their demands, they were rooted in a desire for self-determination and a reckoning with historical injustices. They called for the restoration of treaty rights, recognition of tribal sovereignty, and a complete overhaul of how the government dealt with Native American nations. Basically, they wanted the government to honor those treaties that had been, ignored and violated for centuries.
And how did that caravan end? I know they ended up occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, right?
They did. And it was a pivotal moment. Imagine, a group of Native Americans taking over the very institution they saw as responsible for so much of their suffering. They even put up a teepee on the BIA lawn, a powerful visual statement.
So it wasn't just about symbolism, though, right? Did they actually achieve anything concrete through that occupation?
Well, they did manage to secure some significant wins, although limited in the end. The government agreed to review Ames' proposals about treaty rights and sovereignty, and they granted the protesters immunity from prosecution, I mean.
So they had a seat at the table, at least.
Yeah, in a way, but maybe even more important, they got their hands on a bunch of BIA documents. They took them when they left.
What was in those documents?
Well, the documents, they showed a long history of broken promises, mismanagement, outright corruption within the BIA. It was a bombshell, really. And it further exposed the government's failure to uphold its treaty obligations.
Wow. So even though it was, well, tumultuous, the BIA occupation gave AIM a taste of victory. It must have emboldened them, setting the stage for what would happen at Wounded Knee.
Precisely. The events in D.C. also led to BIA Commissioner Louis Bruce being fired, which, well, that just reinforced Ames' belief that real change wouldn't come from within the system. It had to be, fought for from the outside. And that brings us back to Pine Ridge, with AIM arriving at Wounded Knee, ready for another showdown.
Feels like a powder keg about to explode. Where do we go from here?
Well, before we dive into the occupation itself, we need to understand what was happening on Pine Ridge, leading up to Ames' arrival.
Perfect. Let's dig into that.
We have to remember, Pine Ridge in the 70s, it wasn't just those internal tribal politics. It was affected by what was happening in the broader society too. All that, social and political stuff.
Mm.
Well, think about it. The Vietnam War, Watergate, there was this feeling, like people were disillusioned with the government across the country, really.
So you're saying there was a parallel
Wow.
between how the country was feeling and what was going on at Pine Ridge.
Exactly. You had this superpower, stuck in this unpopular war, and then you have these indigenous people fighting for their rights on land that they'd been pushed onto, and they understood that, the power of symbolism, media attention. They knew that by occupying Wounded Knee, well, it was the site of a massacre, right? So they could force the world to pay attention to their struggle.
It was a risky strategy, though, wasn't it? Our sources, they describe the situation as like this volatile mix, of carefully staged symbolism and then this reality that was escalating really quickly.
Well, it was a dangerous game, no doubt. They presented themselves as warriors, right, defending their people, their land, but they also took hostages, fired shots at law enforcement, made threats.
Yeah.
And that heightened the tension.
Yeah. Things could have easily spiraled out of control. You had FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, heavily armed, under pressure to resolve the situation, and then on the other side you have AIM members and their supporters, some armed, some not, but all of them, well, deeply committed to the cause.
And don't forget Dick Wilson and his goons. They were adding fuel to the fire. They weren't officially sanctioned by the government, but they got federal funds. And they operated with a level of autonomy that, it just complicated things further.
It's hard to imagine what it was like for the people who lived in Wounded Knee, caught in the middle of all this.
Yeah. Our sources, they talk about the fear, the uncertainty. They essentially became pawns, in this bigger power struggle. Their lives disrupted, their homes turned into a battleground.
Sounds like a siege mentality set in on both sides.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Food, supplies, they're scarce. Communication was limited, and there was this threat of violence, just hanging in the air. It was a pressure cooker, everyone on edge.
The media must have played a huge role in shaping how the public saw what was happening at Wounded Knee.
You're right. The occupation became a spectacle, a media spectacle. Those images, armed AIM members facing off against federal agents, broadcast nationwide. It turned the standoff into this symbol of the broader fight for Native American rights.
But it also led to some pretty harsh criticism of AIM, didn't it?
It did. Some media outlets, they portrayed them as violent, radicals threatening the peace. Public opinion was divided. Some saw them as heroes, freedom fighters. Others saw them as dangerous criminals.
So the occupation really, really exposed those deep divisions within American society
Hmm.
about race, history, the legacy of colonialism.
It did. And as the standoff dragged on,
Yeah.
for weeks, the pressure on both sides, it just intensified. We see Trimback, the FBI agent, he's struggling to contain the situation,
Yeah.
caught between what his superiors in Washington want and then the realities on the ground.
What kind of pressure was he facing?
Oh, he was in a really tough spot. The government wanted a quick resolution,
Yeah.
but any misstep could have, led to bloodshed, potentially another massacre at Wounded Knee. He knew the weight of history, on his shoulders.
It's amazing to me that despite all the tension, the potential for violence, it didn't escalate. It didn't become a full-blown tragedy.
That's something that often gets overlooked, isn't it? Trinback, he deserves some credit for that. He recognized that they needed dialogue, restraint, even when he was under so much pressure to take a more forceful approach.
And it's important to remember that it wasn't just men involved. The role of women was crucial.
You're right. The media, they often focused on the male leaders,
Yeah.
right, like Banks and Means.
Yeah.
But women, they were essential
Mm.
to the day-to-day running of the occupied village.
What were some of their contributions?
Well, they cared for the children, provided food, medical care. They kept morale up. They were the backbone, really, of the resistance. Often overlooked, but absolutely vital to its endurance. And their presence, it challenged that stereotypical image,
Yeah.
of the aggressive, warlike Native American male. It showed the world that this was a struggle for the survival of whole communities,
Yeah.
not just the actions of a few militant leaders.
Reading through the accounts, it's hard not to feel, well, the psychological toll this must have taken on everyone involved. The constant threat of violence, the isolation, the uncertainty.
It must have been incredibly grueling. And that's something, we forget sometimes when we study history, the trauma, the scars, the lasting scars, both physical and emotional.
So even though the occupation ended eventually, the issues that led to it, they didn't just vanish, did they?
Exactly. Wounded Knee was a symptom of a much, much deeper problem. The systemic oppression of Native Americans,
Yeah.
the broken promises of treaties, and that ongoing struggle for self-determination. The occupation, well, it brought those issues to the forefront of the national consciousness. It sparked a wave of activism, legal challenges that continue to this day.
It strikes me that we're talking about, well, two different Wounded Knees. You have the historical landmark, right? A place of tragedy remembrance, but also the site of resistance, a symbol of Native American activism.
And those two aspects, they're inseparable, really. The memory of the 1890 massacre, well, that's what fuels the power of what happened in 73. It directly challenges that narrative of defeat, assimilation.
Yeah.
The one that the government tried to impose on Native Americans.
Yeah, AM choosing Wounded Knee, it was deliberate. It wasn't just some random spot. They were invoking the ghosts of the past, reminding everyone that the violence, the injustice against Native Americans. No, it wasn't, ancient history. It was still happening.
They were saying, we will not be forgotten. It was a brilliant tactic, but also dangerous. By occupying Wounded Knee, they were daring the government, to repeat the mistakes of the past. AIM was basically betting that the world was watching, and that the U.S., especially with Vietnam going on, they couldn't afford another massacre.
And to a certain extent, that bet, well, it paid off. The occupation, it forced the government to negotiate, to at least acknowledge, AIM's demands, even if the concessions were limited.
You're right, but it also showed,
Yeah.
the limitations of AIM's approach. They achieved some symbolic victories, but they didn't really change the power dynamics between Native Americans and the federal government.
Yeah. We talked about those divisions within AIM, right? Between those who favored, well, militant action like Russell Means, and those who preferred negotiation like Dennis Banks. Do you think those internal struggles, did they weaken the movement?
It's definitely a factor, that tension, between pragmatism and radicalism. It's something a lot of social movements deal with. It's a hard balance to strike, especially when you're up against, well, an opponent as powerful as the U.S. government.
It's easy to get caught up in the big political drama, but we can't forget about the people who lived in Wounded Knee. Their village became a battleground. Their lives were upended. Their community was, well, traumatized.
The sources, they only give us a glimpse, really, into the human cost of all of this. The stories of those who were there, who lived through it, both native and non-native, they they deserve to be heard, understood. It's a reminder that history isn't just, dates and events. It's about people's lives.
If you had to pick one lasting legacy of the Wounded Knee occupation, what would it be?
I think it's how it changed the conversation, the national conversation about Native American rights. It forced Americans to confront some uncomfortable truths about
Right.
their own history, to acknowledge those broken treaties, the systemic injustices that had been, well, ignored for far too long.
It was a wake-up call, wasn't it? It showed everyone that the struggle for Native American self-determination, well, it wasn't over.
Absolutely, and that struggle it continues today. AM itself, it may have fractured, faded, but the issues they fought for, they're still relevant. Native American communities, they still face poverty, discrimination, health disparities
Yeah.
at much higher rates than other groups. The fight for treaty rights, or for land sovereignty, for cultural preservation, it goes on.
So what can we learn from the Wounded Knee occupation? What does it all mean for us today?
It teaches us that history isn't just something in a textbook. It's a living force. It shapes the present. The wounds of the past, they can fester, erupt if they're not addressed. And while activism, protest, they can shine a light on injustice. Lasting change, real change, it requires a shift in power, and a genuine willingness to confront the root causes of inequality.
It's a powerful story. It challenges us to look at our own history with open eyes, to try and understand the perspectives of those who have been, well, marginalized,
And
silenced.
maybe most importantly, it reminds us that the fight for justice, it's a process, a continuous process.
Mm.
It requires vigilance, courage, and a commitment to creating a future where everyone's rights, everyone's dignity are respected, protected.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us, exploring the Wounded Knee occupation. It's a complex story with layers we're still uncovering. But as you continue to learn about it, think about this. How can we as individuals, as a society, help to heal those wounds of the past
Yeah.
and build a more just, equitable future for everyone?